In the 1980s, Van Halen insisted in their rider that there were to be no Brown M&Ms present at all in the backstage area. There were also a bunch of other crazy requests in their rider as well, which I'll reveal later in the video, but the most famous, of course, is no Brown M&Ms. If they were to find any backstage, the promoter would forfeit the show at full price, and often the band would trash the dressing rooms just to send a message. One story at the time claimed that the band caused $450,000 of damage because they found Brown M&Ms backstage. But that wasn't quite true. There's actually a very valid and rather genius reason for this request in their rider. Buckle in and let me explain the full story. Hopefully you don't know it already. And if you did, well, why did you click on this video? You saw the title and the thumbnail. Oh, and if you love delving into music history like I do, click subscribe and join our pack. Now, ridiculous rider requests are nothing new, and the concept of these sorts of requests can probably be traced all the way back to the Beatles, or possibly even Elvis in the 50s. These acts had enough star power at the time to justify what they asked for. But the Beatles had incredibly modest requests, given their size, and especially compared to some of the stories you hear nowadays. According to reports, at their 1965 show at the Shea Stadium in New York City, all they asked for was a case of Coca-Cola and a television set. Perfectly reasonable. They'd also ask for things like police protection, appropriate sound and lighting equipment, and would refuse to play in front of a segregated audience. You know, reasonable, logical stuff for a band of their size. Although by 2002, Paul McCartney had changed slightly. He was requesting stuff like 6 leafy floor plants and halogen floor lamps with dimmer switches. The Rolling Stones have always had a reputation of incredibly large riders, including gourmet food and drink, and then you've got the really ridiculous requests. Iggy Pop would ask for a Bob Hope impersonator, 7 dwarves, and a motorbike as a gag. Prince would need a physician on hand to inject him with vitamin B12 before each show. And Mariah Carey was rumoured to demand baskets of puppies or bunny rabbits backstage, and even an attendant to dispose of her used chewing gum. And these are the sorts of riders that are just ridiculous and couldn't possibly contribute to the quality of the show in any way. I mean, I guess you could argue that a basket of puppies would de-stress you before a show, but you know what I mean, completely unreasonable requests. And you might be quick to put Van Halen's requests of absolutely no M&Ms in that same category as well, but you'd be wrong to do so. The rider contract for this particular tour in 1982 consisted of 53 pages. Now, I know this because the website, The Smoking Gun, acquired a genuine copy of the rider in 2008. And I'll pop a link to it in the description down below if you want to read the whole thing. It's worth doing. The first page said this: "Dear purchaser, attached is a rider containing provisions to assure you of a smooth and professional theatrical presentation. All provisions are spelled out in great detail in order to prevent any misunderstandings and to present to your customers the finest in contemporary entertainment. Any immediate questions can be answered by calling Van Halen Productions at 213-467-4228. All provisions must be adhered to strictly. Please feel free to contact us at any time should there be any questions. Looking forward to a successful show. Sincerely, Harvey Shapps, tour manager, and Patrick Whiteley, production manager." On this rider, requests included full breakfast and dinner menus, also specifying that forks had to be metal and had to have 4 prongs, an assortment of beers, orange, grapefruit, grape, and apple juice, Jack Daniel's Black Label, vodka, herring served in sour cream, that's an odd one, freshly baked bread, an entire cheese board, and a large tube of KY jelly. God knows what they were doing with that. However, the most famous, the most legendary request, the one that arguably mythologized the band, was absolutely no Brown M&Ms. This particular rider request was David Lee Roth's idea. He was the man who decided to put this clause in. It's underlined and in capital letters and everything. Now, Van Halen's concerts in the 80s were huge, and I don't mean in terms of attendance, I mean in terms of the production. They were apparently the first band to ever take a specific sort of stage light on tour with them. 850 par lamp lights. That means nothing to me, but if you are a nerd when it comes to lighting, it might be exciting for you. The important thing is, these were very big, heavy lights, and David Lee Roth was directly involved in designing the lighting setup for these shows. And most of the venues that they were playing in were old buildings. They were built in the 50s or 60s and weren't particularly compatible or equipped to handle this sort of lighting arrangement. And the time it took to build and tear down these setups were massive. 8 or 9 hours just to set up the lighting and equipment. And part of that was because crews were unfamiliar with such a massive production. But also it was because promoters who didn't read the contract rider properly wouldn't have the necessary stuff in place in order for these venues to properly accommodate all the lighting and equipment. And this really was important stuff because the safety of the audience and the band and crew were at risk. Stuff like load-bearing problems, structural weakness, or electricity overloads. Van Halen's production required the promoter to set up in a very specific way, in a way that would allow them to come in and set up their equipment in a safe and efficient manner. In other words, it was crucial for the promoters, the people putting on the show, to read the specifications laid out in that rider. It was literally a matter of life and death. So, David Lee Roth came up with the genius solution of popping that small M&Ms clause in the middle of the phone book-sized rider. Because if they saw any Brown M&Ms backstage, it was very likely that the promoter hadn't read the rest of the rider contract. Which then would have meant a bunch more work for the band and crew. If they spotted Brown M&Ms, they'd have to do a thorough check of all the equipment and lighting to make sure everything was safe and ready to go. Because if they didn't, they could be faced with a collapsed stage, or an electricity overload, or who knows what. It was very serious stuff. And I suppose David Lee Roth had a teeny bit of diva energy in him because if he did find Brown M&Ms, he would make a point to trash the dressing rooms, as a message to the promoter. And with this reputation beginning to catch on, it got to the point where David Lee Roth would arrive at a venue and see elderly women using latex gloves and separating all the Brown M&Ms manually. It sounds ridiculous, but it was worth it for the safety of the show. Now, I mentioned earlier about that story that claimed Van Halen had caused $450,000 worth of damage because they found some Brown M&Ms backstage. According to David Lee Roth, though, the media mixed this one up. A venue in New Mexico had recently installed a brand new, expensive rubberized flooring. When the band arrived, guess what David Lee Roth spotted backstage? Yep, Brown M&Ms. So, as he normally would, he trashed the dressing room and caused, according to him, about $200 worth of damage. However, again, because the promoter hadn't read the rider contract properly, a disaster happened with the stage. Because of the sheer weight of the lights and the equipment, the stage started to sink into that shiny new rubberized flooring, causing nearly $500,000 worth of damage. But of course, if the promoters had read the rider contract properly, all of that would have been avoided. They would have known that the stage had to support a certain amount of weight. The media at the time latched onto this and spun it into Van Halen caused $500,000 of damage by trashing the venue because they found Brown M&Ms. Now, Van Halen weren't quick to correct their mistake, because let's face it, that's a pretty rock and roll reputation, isn't it? It totally worked in their favour. So they got the best of both worlds. They got to be perceived as these ultimate divas who hated Brown M&Ms for some reason, living the ultimate rock and roll touring lifestyle, while actually driving home a really important point of safety to the promoters. Because imagine being a promoter for the next gig, waking up that morning, reading the newspaper and seeing $450,000 worth of damage happen to the previous venue. You'd read that in the paper and think, ooh, I should probably go and read that rider again. Now, I should mention that all the information in this video, the reason why they demanded no Brown M&Ms backstage, did all come from David Lee Roth himself. So I guess there's a small chance that he made it all up to make Van Halen seem less diva-ish. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And for the story of a disaster that happened in a venue that inspired one of the greatest rock and roll songs of all time, click over there and watch my video about how Deep Purple wrote Smoke on the Water.